So, I've recently bought my own house. A momentous achievement, yes. Of course, especially for a single 28-year-old male. It's hard in this economy. But if you've had a lot of years of working and saving, it becomes way easier. It's hard in this economy, but if you have an income from a partner, it also makes things easier. But neither of those really apply to me. Yes, if I'd started a trade apprenticeship at 16, I would have had way more years of experience by now, but I went down the university path. And I also botched my career early on, so I kind of wasted 2 to 3 extra years as well. So despite all this, I've managed to buy my own house. But that's where the story stops for most people. You hear some unique outlier who managed to buy their own house. Some are happy when they hear this, some are envious, some are jealous, some get filled with hate. But do you ever really know the financial situation of this person? More often than not, the answer is no. So today, I'll pull the curtains back on the financial situation of a guy who managed to buy his own house at the age of 28. We'll talk about the cost of my house, the loan/mortgage I received from the bank, my income, and my savings and finances related to that stuff. Once all of those have been revealed, we will see if I am truly house poor. But first, what is being house poor? Simply put, it's where, yes, you have managed to secure your own house, but now the costs/repayments involved with that house are totally eating away at your finances. It's basically like being poor, but now you also have a house as opposed to no house. That's basically what being house poor is. Now let's react to a few TikToks talking about being house poor, and then we will delve into my situation as it relates to being house poor.
Is being house poor worth it? Is owning a house but not being able to do anything, not being able to afford to go out and experience more life and make memories worth it? I see so many people on this app that are like, oh, well, I enjoy my mortgage and stuff like that. But do you? You get one life. That's it. We all know that, okay? And to be stuck at home for maybe even, just say, the next 10 years, doing really nothing, watching Netflix and rotting away, is it really worth it? Because you felt the need, because society tells you that, if you don't own a house at some point, you're failing in life. You felt the need to follow those footsteps, and now you're stuck at home. I just feel like that's not worth it anymore. Yes, back in the day, you could own a house, you could go on trips, you could have this whole family thing, all this. But y'all that are trying to flex on others saying, oh, well, I own a house. You don't. Yeah, but at least they have the money to rent and leave the house and go and do things. I'm not saying you have to go party every weekend or anything like that, but at least they can go out and see their family, fly somewhere, take vacations. Give me your opinions in the comments, please.
So this dude mentions the whole, at least I have a house thing, so who cares that I'm poor? I get it. There's a lot of pressure on people to get their own houses. However, people will over-leverage themselves to a point where their house gobbles up a huge chunk of their income, and now they're financially stuck for decades. It's not as if all your repayments are going towards paying off your house either. Look at the split of interest versus principal payments in the first 10 years of a loan. Most of your mortgage repayments literally go to the bank. People will get pressured into buying a house, and now their mortgage costs them about $700 a week, when they could have continued renting for $400 a week. That extra $300 a week cushion goes a long way. Next TikTok.
Many millennials regret buying homes. This is why it's important for you to run your numbers so that you don't end up house poor. Let me show you what I mean. What you can qualify for and what you can comfortably afford is sometimes two different things. So if you make $100,000, the typical debt to income ratio a lender is going to use when qualifying you is about 40%. That gives you $40,000 divided by 12 months, gives you a monthly allowance of $3,333 if you have no debt. So you could buy probably around a $400,000 house, your payment would be around $3,300, and you would just qualify and you'd be celebrating. But the next step you must take with your family is, what is your take-home pay? If you make $100,000, your take-home pay is around what? $6,200? If your house payment without utilities or anything is $3,300, that is 53% of your net pay. This is where you're creeping into the house poor area, and you don't want to be there. But I understand your frustration, because you're like, hey, I make $100,000. How can I find anything for under $400,000? Because back in the day, the financially responsible thing to do was to have your house payment be about 30% of your net. But if that were true for someone making $100K today, they would have to buy a $240,000 home, which doesn't really exist in most places. So I understand your frustration. But when you sit down with your lender, also sit down with your family, talk with your lender, and look at your net pay so that you don't end up house poor and you can actually enjoy the home you're purchasing.
So this guy summarizes the finances pretty well. Too many people here in Australia borrowed money when interest rates were super low, and when they went up, they struggled to afford the new repayments. Here in Australia, we don't have lifelong rates we can lock in. At best, it's about 3 to 5 years from what I've seen, but it's usually less. So if you're locked in a 2% mortgage repayment, after rates went way up, your new rates were now around 6% or higher. If your monthly repayments went from $1,800 to $3,000 a month, now you're in trouble. The regulations here in Australia usually have some sort of stress test involved, which checks your ability to repay a loan if the rates were a bit higher. But rates going from 0.1% to 4.35% was not something that would have been built into their buffers. Next TikTok.
Being house poor is a legit contradiction because on the one hand, you own, quote unquote, the asset, but even that might not be true. You have to understand a lot of people owe money on their home. They owe money to the government, they owe money to the bank, they owe money. Like the home isn't something they truly own because so much of it is ongoing costs and so much of it is debt servicing the debt on the home. And it's also something that is very challenging because most people who are house poor are literally living in the so-called asset. So how can you call it an asset, a true asset, if you're living and using it and you're unable to generate really any income from it at all? So it's not truly an income generating asset. You can argue that it's appreciating, but the appreciation is kind of covering all of the costs that I just talked about. So that's why, yes, it is a contradiction, but it is how it is. So a lot of people own a home, they owe so much continual money on it that it cuts into the rest of their lifestyle. So because they have to service this massive responsibility that is their primary home, they don't have money to go on vacations anymore. They don't have money to go do X, Y, and Z anymore. And that's why they feel poor. Is even though they have a roof over their heads, they genuinely have less money to spend because their house is sucking up so much of their money. That's what it means.
So a lot of people debate whether a house is an asset or not. I side with a house being an asset, but I get it. You're paying a lot for the house. It's a money gobbler. But in some cases, people rent out spare rooms, which in turn provides some good income. But either way, this is another point towards the whole house poor thing. Congrats, you may have gotten yourself a house, and it is an impressive achievement. However, it doesn't make full financial sense in a lot of cases. As I mentioned earlier, if your rent costs are $400 a week, but now you buy a house / apartment / whatever, and now that costs you $700 a week, let alone utilities, bills, taxes, etc., you're going to have poor cash flow for like more than a decade. Yes, rent money doesn't go towards anything you own, but neither does a lot of your early mortgage repayments. That money is instead going to the bank. In terms of shelter, you're going to have to be giving someone money, whether that be the landlord or the bank. So those were a few TikToks on this situation. Now let's talk about me and my house poor circumstance. I'll talk about the cost of my house, the money I put down, the loan I took, the repayments for that loan, and my income. So my house, all in all, cost about $600,000. I did not actually purchase my land and house at once. I purchased them separately. What happens in areas with available land supply is that you have the option of buying your own piece of land, and then you have the choice of employing a home builder to build a house on your land afterwards. This is what I did. I'll talk more on the strategy behind this in another video. It can certainly be risky, but in my case it worked out quite well. My land cost me about $325,000, or closer to $328,000 after some fees, and my house cost about $272,000 when all was said and done, which totals around $600,000. But there were a few more fees involved, but it was basically $600K all up. That was the price I had to pay, but the most recent valuation of my house was $715,000. This is the median figure of the range between recent estimates. Obviously, it's not 100% accurate, but based on other comparable sales, $715,000 is a pretty reasonable amount. Now, the reason I paid a much lower price than its most recent valuation is because I first purchased the land itself in late 2021, meaning I locked in a price at that point in time. Sounds good? And well, yeah, kinda. But for my state of Victoria, late 2021 was near the peak of the market. It's not like I purchased in 2019 or purchased in Perth. Although I got it a bit cheaper versus the time I actually had to pay for the land, there were much better deals out there, notably in other states or years prior. As for the house, I signed a contract prior to May 2024, which means there were some new updated regulations for buying new houses that I did not have to put into my house. Yeah, these regulations may have added value to my house, but more so than anything, it just adds to the cost of the house, not the value itself. One big reason houses are so unaffordable these days is due to the lack of starter homes, topic for another time. But if you buy a new house, it almost has to come with all the bells and whistles. My house, for example, has central heating/cooling. Find me a house built before 1990 that had central heating and cooling. You likely can't. You can also figure this out by looking at what houses in new estates look like versus older estates. The houses in new estates look exponentially better, but this obviously comes with an added cost. But again, story for another video. So, because I signed this contract prior to May 2024, I avoided an extra $20,000 to $30,000 more in house costs. So this house price I paid in 2025 was a bit lower than it otherwise would be in the year of 2025. I locked in a price from a prior year. Now with that said, I could have gotten a cheaper house still. I got some upgrades with my house like raised roofs, bigger tiles, a bunch of other shit that could have easily knocked an extra 10 grand off the price of the house. Or I could have also gotten a smaller house, something like 3 bedrooms, 1 lounge, 1 car garage, as opposed to what I ended up getting, which is 4 beds, 2 car garage, 2 bathroom, 2 lounge, and 1 outdoor living. You do not have to get a house with these extras. So buying a house now will cost an extra 20 to 30 grand due to new regulations, but you could also just cut a bedroom and some other things to save money on your house. So all in all, cost me about 600 grand. Now what down payment did I use for my land and my house? I used a total down payment of $132,162.77 for my land. $1,000 to hold it initially, the rest of the 5% deposit once things were more formal, and then $115,912.77 extra once the land was ready. So that's the land. Now for the house/construction. I paid $2,000 for the home builder to hold the price and start the whole drawing up the design and whatever other shit they could do. Then $11,701.05 for the remaining 5% deposit, and then another $33,307.06 as it's a comfortable buffer I had in my bank account at the time, resulting in a total down payment of my house of $47,008.11. But that's not all. In a lot of cases in Australia, the government will give you an extra 10 grand to go towards your first home, known as the First Homeowners Grant. You do need to submit a lot of documents to prove you're actually building a house. You can't just ask the bank for 10 grand. It doesn't come from the bank. It comes from the State Revenue Office, I believe, but the bank can sort this shit out for you, and they sorted it out for me. So on top of my down payments, there's another $10,000 involved. There was also an extra $534 I paid out of my bank account. Long story, but the bank fucked up one of my progress payments to my home builder. They underpaid them by $534, so I just paid that out of my bank account, meaning it formed a part of my total down payment, since it wasn't money I needed to borrow from the bank. With all of that tallied, my total down payment towards my house amounted to $189,704.88. With a house cost of about $600,000, paying about $190,000 means I need to borrow about $410,000 to cover the rest of the cost. I was easily able to get this from the bank, but depending on your income amount, type of income, example business or employee, and spending and debt levels, you may have trouble getting the bank loan that you need. Now, I borrowed about $410,000 from the bank. Well, it was more like $412,000 with fees, but same. Obviously, this means I have repayments I need to make. So what are my repayments? Based off recent interest rate values, my repayments per month equal $2,319, which times 12 is $27,828 a year. Divide by 52 means it costs about $535.15 a week, which to me sounds a lot more manageable than the other options since most of my budgeting is done using weekly figures. It's important to note that this does not include any council rates, taxes, energy, internet, water, or anything else involved with my house, but the mortgage does take the bulk of the housing costs. My internet costs me about $113 a month. Very expensive, but I lived in the middle of nowhere with my parents most of my life, so being closer to good internet, I'm willing to pay a bit extra to ensure my internet doesn't cut out on me. My energy bill varies. Lately it's been somewhere around $60 a month. My water bill seems like it'll be around $220 every 3 months. Land tax costs $500. Not sure how long. I think this is a yearly thing. It better be a yearly thing. It better not be half a year. Not sure what my council rates will be at this point, but it's probably going to be some unnecessarily high figure. So when you tally all these together, that's about $601.62 per week, $2,607 a month, or $31,284 a year. Now that figure starts to sound a lot worse, but even then, $600 a week for most costs included is a pretty good deal, especially when you consider this house is pretty decently sized in a nice area. But keep in mind that this doesn't include the council rates or insurances, as I currently don't know what those figures would be, and if anything, the rate cuts that are coming will just reduce this payment further, but then the payments will increase once we consider insurances and council rates and anything else involved in the house. So that's what it cost me for my house. Now, what about my income? Can I comfortably afford to be losing $600 a week on my house alone, not including groceries, fuel, etc.? Now, I have many income streams. However, the most consistent and the ones that pay the most are my employment-related jobs. I work full-time in accounting and part-time at a supermarket. These hours are guaranteed, or at least some of them are, so I don't get paid as much as I would otherwise if I was a casual. Now, here's a breakdown of my income sources. Ignore rent for now. I don't actually receive any rental income as of yet, but it is something I'm looking at. So we can see that on a net per week basis, I earn about $1,812.47 after tax. However, the tax rate considered for my part-time supermarket job here is incorrect. I get taxed a lot less. However, at the end of the financial year, I always owe a lot of tax to the government. So on a cash flow basis, I end up with a fair bit more than $589.17 in my bank account per week. However, if I was to apply my proper tax rate to each payslip, I'd end up with $589.17 per week from the wagey job. But for the sake of this video, I'm essentially downplaying my income to check how house poor I really am. So earlier we calculated that it cost me about $600 a week all up. And we can see that my part-time job alone covers almost all of my housing costs, leaving my full-time job income free to cover groceries, fuel, and any other expenses related to my life. Based off this after-tax figure, my house costs me about 33% of my after-tax income. Some metrics would consider this under mortgage stress, but personally, I don't think this is anywhere near that bad. I've seen people whose rents/mortgage costs are closer to 50% of their income, maybe even more in some cases. So no, this does not stress me out. And again, consider the fact that if anything, my after-tax payments for my second job are usually a fair bit higher than this. Now, I said earlier to ignore rent, but let's include it for the sake of this video now. Given that rent of $620 is actually pretty standard, $200 for two of the rooms and $220 for another room that is larger and has a better bed than the others, AI analysis reckons I can get more in rent due to the type of house I have, its location, furnishments, etc., but $620 a week is what I'd gun for really. We have about $600 in costs per week, and then we have $620 in rental income per week. So my rent literally covers my housing costs, assuming that the insurances and council rates aren't too high. You'll note that the $620 net and gross amount is the same. That's because you don't get taxed on your rent payments per week. You work that out at the end of the year. But in the meantime, for cash flow purposes, the rent covers the housing costs. And even then you have some taxation benefits for having part of your house used for investment purposes. But either way, my rental income basically covers the costs involved with my house, which is a pretty sweet position to be in. So if we include the rental income I'm expected to receive, that reduces my housing cost to 25% on my after-tax income, a pretty comfortable buffer. No matter how we slice it, I am in a pretty comfortable position, but let's remove the rent and the second job income and only leave my accounting job. If I did not have the ability to receive rental income, or my second job, my housing costs would total almost 50% on my take-home pay, which is an enormous difference compared to what we calculated earlier. Amazing what the difference of a second job has on your financial position. Alright, so we've established that I'm not house poor, apologies for the somewhat misleading YouTube title, but let's be honest, no one is going to click on a video titled, I'm a 28-year-old male and my house repayments are very comfortable. But now that you're here, hopefully you can learn a thing or two to help your financial situation out. So, I'm not house poor. We established earlier the situation behind my house and that a few dominoes did fall my way. But honestly, the primary benefit to my life has been my income sources. It doesn't matter what deals I manage to secure with my house if I can't even afford the down payment or get the loan in the first place. So my total down payment of about $190,000, even if we say about $20,000 per year, was due to my second job, after taxes and whatnot, and then we had about 4 years of saving before I even owed the bank that money. That's $80,000. Remove $80,000 from my down payment, and now I need to borrow this money, leaving my loan amount at about $492,000 instead of $412,000. With this higher loan amount, that makes my monthly repayments $2,714 a month, or $32,568 per year, or $626.30 per week. That doesn't sound like much more than what I'm currently repaying, but consider my mortgage currently is about $535 a week, almost $100 less. That makes a big difference to your cash flow each week. That's a big fancy-ass dinner I can afford per week due to having a smaller mortgage. So a big reason why I am not house poor is because I poured a lot more money than normal into the cost of my house. If I didn't have this down payment on standby, I'd have to borrow that money. However, with my accounting job alone, I would not have the borrowing capacity to borrow almost $500,000. With my 2 jobs at the peak of the interest rate environment, I was able to borrow around $515,000, barely enough with 2 jobs. Even with my one accounting job alone, I think the most they let me borrow was a bit less than $400,000. So even if I had the down payment I had without the second job, the bank wouldn't have lent me the money required to buy this house. So the only reason I was able to get my particular house was due to the second job. Now, a lot of people don't have to grind as hard as I did because usually they'll have a partner to help them out. However, that involves the obvious risk of a breakup down the track, which means you'd both lose out on the house, depending on the specific situation, kids, etc. But in my case, I have no such risk. I'm not even one job loss away from losing my house, because as we've established, I have an impenetrable wagey job and rental income to fall back on, and accounting is a relatively in-demand career path too, so I doubt I'd struggle for years to find a new job if something were to happen to mine. Point is, most people can buy a house with way less effort than what I had, but they're one relationship breakup away from no house. It's not like you can just get a new girlfriend tomorrow and swap her in from the house. It's not how it works. You can do that with a job though. But I, on the other hand, have managed to build an enormous safety moat for myself. Back to the house poor topic, the other reason I'm not house poor is because my second job had a weekend contract that I was able to keep once I started this current full-time job. Without this opportunity, I wouldn't have had all that extra income. I've ranted about this in prior videos, but I do not consider my second job as lucky. During the lockdowns, I was working and getting paid less than what people were getting to sit at home all day. So this is a correction in my eyes. This stable, secure job that has helped fund my real estate was a correction for the struggles of 2020. Another reason I'm not house poor is due to buying a bigger house in a nicer area. This doesn't make sense at first, since bigger house in better area would obviously result in a higher house cost, which is true. However, due to having 3 spare bedrooms as opposed to only 1 or none, I can obviously extract more rental income. And being in a nicer area, there's a lot more demand for rentals around my region, meaning I don't have issues with vacancy rates. Example, if you can only get your rooms rented out for half the year, yeah, that's still nice income, but it's not as stable or consistent as having your rooms rented out for 52 weeks in a year. So that's my video on the house poor situation. Fortunately, I'm not in that boat. However, it's not like I had this house handed to me on a silver platter. I spent a lot of time working over the past almost 5 years to get to this point. And thankfully, I can afford to back off now if I want. I can totally drop the retail job and have those hours free and have rental income assist me, but I won't do that for now. I'm going to stockpile a huge investment/cash safety net before considering that idea. Are you house poor? Is buying a house even a good idea for your situation? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. That is all.